So we start. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to our panel, Freedom and Responsibility for the Spoken Word. This panel is part of the first Mediterranean theological meetings that we are holding here in Vienna, actually in Lausanne. And this is an ecumenical program for students of theology, Catholic students, Orthodox students, and Protestant students of theology. This program actually started in Dubrovnik, and it was held there for 2 years in 2019 and 2021. It was a program organized by the Archbishop Koryutro Rijeka now, and then the Bishop of Dubrovnik, Mate Uzinic. And since he changed, he came from Dubrovnik to Rijeka, and now he's our Archbishop, he decided to continue here this project with a different name, but still the idea is the same. The idea of this program is to bring together students of theology to reflect together on different topics that concern all of us, Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox, especially coming from our neighbor countries. So there are students in this program coming from Croatia, but also from Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Slovenia, and also Macedonia, and this year also from Italy. And so the idea is to be together for a week and reflect on a certain topic which is important for us today. This year the topic is freedom and responsibility for the spoken word. Especially during the pandemic, the question of freedom came out really strongly. So we decided to speak about freedom and responsibility, but also in relation to society, in relation to us as theologians, our freedom in the church, our responsibility in our churches, in the society. So this is a topic that we are reflecting on this week. And this evening, we will all together have the chance to hear something about it from our 4 lecturers. So I will present them to you quickly. So I am glad to have with us this evening. I will start with our only female professor, which is Professor Marianne Heimer-Scheins. She is coming from Westfälische Wilhelms Universität Münster, so from Germany. She is a Catholic theologian, director of the Institute for Christian Social Teaching, and head of the Office for Gender Theological Researches at the Catholic Theological Faculty of the University of Münster. She is a member of the Central Committee of German Catholics, and she published various works, among them Christliche Sozialethik, for example, and so on. So welcome, and thank you for being with us. The second professor I will start from the end now is Professor Cyril Hoverum, coming from the University College of Stockholm. Cyril Hoverum is an Orthodox archimandrite and theologian, professor of ecclesiology, international relations, and ecumenism at Stockholm University College. Professor Hoverum is actually Ukrainian, so this is also important for us that he is with us in this time. He has been a visiting professor at a number of universities around the world, including Yale, Columbia, and Münster. Among various of his books, he published a book named Political Orthodoxies and also Meta-Ecclesiology. So Professor Cyril Hoverum is the first one in the line. I'm also glad to greet Professor Luke Bretherton, coming from Duke University in Durham, USA. Actually, Professor Bretherton is British and Anglican. So he is a Protestant theologian, professor of moral and political theology at Duke Divinity School in the United States. Along his scholarly work, he writes in the media on topics related to religion and politics. From his various books, we can name Resurrecting Democracy and Christ and the Common Life, Political Theology, and the Case for Democracy. So welcome, Professor Brotherton. And finally, we have the pleasure to have with us one of our Croatian professors. This is Professor Branko Muric, coming from the University of Zagreb. He is a Catholic theologian, a professor in the Department of Fundamental Theology at the Catholic Theological Faculty of the University of Zagreb, where he holds the position of Vice Dean. In his scientific teaching and professional work, his special interests are topics of God's revelation, questions of the foundations of faith and how to understand it, and the relationship between God and man. Recently, in 2021, he and the theologian Gianluigi Pasquale published together the book Teologia Fondamentale, il Logos tra comprendere e credere. So, Professor Muric, welcome. So now we will start the panel. I have many questions. Maybe we won't be able in an hour to cover all the topics we want. But my first question goes to Professor Brotherton. In the opening speech of our Mediterranean theological meetings, Monsignor Uzinic said, God created us and in Jesus Christ redeemed us for freedom. Freedom is a gift. It is one of basic human characteristics, so important that the fullness of humanity is measured by the measure of freedom. Who is not free feels not completely human. But freedom is responsible, or it becomes violence. It seems to me that in some countries, for example in Croatia, but also in the US where you are teaching, so Christians are free to promote their values, but not only Christians, all religious people, but also they are heavily involving in questions that polarize society. They are promoting their values sometimes, in some cases, with strong words, imposing in some way their values to others, thus creating strong reactions and polarizing society. Could you help us understand why is this so? Where does that kind of approach come from?
Plethora of mics. It's a huge delight to be with you, and it's my first time in Croatia, and I've fallen in love. So it's I'm hopefully back. So yes, that's a wonderful question. I think there's a number of things to say in relation to that, and I don't think this is a problem specific to Christians or other religious people. I think we see this as a phenomena across all political ideologies, if you like, and Christians are kind of caught up in this as a general phenomenon. I think one of the problems is, so I think it's a general phenomenon, but I think it does have Christian roots. And the root is we have tended to see political projects, penultimate political projects, and remember we live in this age before Christ's return. So we don't live in the messianic age, as it were. Part of our problem is we have confused pursuit of the common good with pursuit of the kingdom of God. And so we tend to see political projects as messianic, salvational projects, and therefore over-invest in them. And so we make of really quite mundane questions. How are we going to educate our children? How are we going to organise healthcare? Which side of the road should we drive on? Obviously, it's the left-hand side. That's the way it should be done in the kingdom of God. But I'll give latitude to everyone else at this point. But you know, these very mundane political questions, and they, instead of being very boring political questions, they become metaphysical questions. And so what we have is a situation, we see it in certain kind of left-wing ideas about who's on the right side of history. Well, if it's a debate about who's on the right or the wrong side of history, and if I lose this argument about prisons or education, I'm not simply losing a political, prudential policy matter, I'm compromising the end of history. And therefore, I've got to kind of fight to the death to secure that policy, because if I don't, literally the end of history is in question. And I think we have similar kind of dynamics on the right. Literally the ontological status of the nation is in question if we compromise on questions about sexuality or whatever the issue might be. And so we've massively over-freighted. These political questions carry far too much weight. And I think as Christians, as a confessional matter, we who confess Jesus Christ as Lord should be much more comfortable to confess that this age, before Christ returns, is a secular age, i.e. not religious, but not eternal. And if we live in this age which is not eternal, it can point to, it can anticipate, we can taste now through the work of the Spirit eternal things, but we shouldn't confuse this age with the eternal age. And when we do, we make politics a messianic or metaphysical matter, and then we start killing people for political questions. And I think that's part of what we see in Russia and Ukraine at the moment. So I think that's really the root of this problem. We're very confused about what time it is. And the church needs to be much clearer that it is the time before Christ's return. And how do we point to that, foreshadow that, give a taste of that, not seek in political questions salvational matters. But I don't think that's so I think it has theological roots, but I think many political ideologies have kind of taken on that mantle, and so politics is a religious realm, not a political realm. I want more politics, but just more mundane in its aspirations.
This relation between the church, theology, and society is also something that we have been reflecting these days. And Professor Moritz, you have been speaking about the charism of the theologian, which is to speak about God, to spread the word of the gospel. Monsignor Uzinic said, again, in his opening speech, that the word of the gospel is never neutral. It is inherently charismatic, prophetically provocative. It is a cry, a shout. But is the word of the theologians today truly so in our societies? Is theology today relevant in our societies? Or theologians have somehow distanced themselves from the everyday lives and troubles of the people? And actually someone else maybe took their place and shapes the opinions of the people. So, can you tell us something about it? What do you think?
Yes, I'm in accordance here with Professor Luke, what he said, and I can just suggest that sometimes it seems that theology today is unuseful for society, that we don't know what to do with theology. Also, it seems that this kind of spirit exists also in the church, that we don't know what to do with theologians, that we have theological schools only because we need priests, we need the religious teachers, and so on. But we don't know what to do with theologians, what theologians really are, and what theologians can do in society. I think that today's society also don't see theologians as important persons, as intellectuals. And this is the problem also for church. The second question was, is theology relevant today? It could be, it is, but I think that theology suffers the same as philosophy today. For instance, Jürgen Habermas told right a few decades ago that philosophy is not anymore relevant for describing the world, to express what the world is, and how in the world things going on, what is about ethics and everything else. And I think that this also can be applied to theology. It is important, I think, today, in sense of synodal process, that this is the opportunity for theology, for church, to become more relevant, not only for the church, but also for society. In process of synodality, the main category is to listen word of God, to listen the voice of people, and this listening need to be in some sense, in both senses. Magisterium, bishops need to listen theologians, and also theologians need to listen the voice of church. I think that here we need to be open, dialogically open, for a new answers, for a new answers how became actual. We need to ask ourselves what are the actual questions that bother people today. For instance, we need to ask ourselves what is the topic questions in Croatian society that bothers Croatian society, that really bothers Croatian society, and we need to try to find also theological answers to these questions. I think that in the last years, in the last decades, we didn't really do any matters what theologians speaks about this.
Yes.
Can I just add just a quick
Sure.
reflection? Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And just to, in terms of the second bit of that question about can theology be relevant and broadly how philosophy be relevant, I think we're in a moment when we're faced with huge questions around, whether it's climate change, people are questioning what it means to be a man or a woman. We can edit human DNA. Will there be two kinds of human coming forward? What will be the impact of AI on work, on everything, how we organise life together? So there's massive questions pressing in upon all societies. And I think our universities, our media, they're very allergic to asking questions of meaning and purpose and character. And I think this is where theology and the church, one doesn't have to begin with a Bible verse to raise very serious questions of meaning and purpose and character. What is the meaning and purpose of medicine? What is the meaning and purpose of government? What is the meaning and purpose of work? These are fundamental questions. And if we don't ask those questions, and I think theologians in the church can be key figures pressing and constantly asking those questions, we're not going to have a sense of direction or vision. As we know from Scripture, without vision, the people perish. And so we're going to be constantly just driven either by the forces of the market or by the forces of the state, or in America where I teach, the Elon Musks and the kind of tech entrepreneurs are going to rewire the world for their benefit, not to ours. So I think there's a real place for theology which begins from a place of wonder, as philosophy does. Baumer to Zion, this asks this question of a place of wondering why. And I think the church needs to relearn how to ask that question, why, and then from that ask questions of meaning and purpose, and what should be the character, what should be the quality and character of relationships which make these meanings and these purposes possible. And I think that's a very open question that lots of people feel but don't know how to articulate. But I think the church can be a real catalyst, an important set of figures and theologians pressing and constantly asking. Because people have those questions, they feel insecure, they see these big changes, but they're not given any language to articulate a sense of where we're going, why we're going there, and where should we be going, and what does it mean to be human within all these changes.
I would say a little bit more on this question of relevance of theology. Because you, Professor Heinrich Stein, the other day, you were speaking about the document Dignitatis Humanae, and how the Catholic Church at first was fighting against freedom of religion, and then finally with Dignitatis Humanae embraced the freedom of religion. And so I was wondering, shouldn't we learn something from that? That sometimes the church is faced with new challenges, and the church sees them in the beginning as threats, but maybe they are occasions to learn something new, and maybe even these new insights can really be, let's say, brought in theology accepted by the church and move it also forward. So maybe the fact that the church today is not really capable, it's again seeing new threats. For example, the so-called gender ideology is one of them, and so on. So how should we deal with these new ideas?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Thank you for that I can be here. I think this is a very fundamental question, and it is a question about what is tradition in the church. Because the purpose of the church is to speak out the gospel in every new time. And this is tradition. Tradition is to deliver what is the good news coming from the Bible, coming from Jesus Christ. And it is something which is ever new, to be implanted in a new time, in a new presence. And of course, this cannot be done without a constant process of learning. Yeah? So the history of the church, the history of theology, the history of pastoral work is in a way always a history of learning. And we have seen this in dealing with the human rights question. This was in 19th century, this was a real controversial issue, and the popes of the time were very much against accepting something like individual human rights, freedom rights, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion. It was a kind of terrifying claim with regard to what the church wanted to bring to the people as the truth. And the idea was we cannot accept people to enjoy individual freedom in such things as finding the truth, because they didn't trust the ordinary people, the ordinary Facebook people, to be able to grasp what can the truth be. So there was this strong opposition. And then sometime later, during the Second Vatican Council, happened a quite surprising thing. That the council, the fathers of the council, discovered a new sense, a new meaning of what religious freedom of religion in fact is, and approved of this right as a right of the human person under the notion of human dignity. The text of the council starts with the word human dignity. And this is the very reason to accept the idea, which is quite an old theological idea, that faith, truth, can only be adopted freely. This had been shadowed a bit during historic conflicts of the early modern times, but they were rediscovered. And how were they rediscovered? By listening. We also already had this important topic. By listening to experiences of Christians, of bishops, of people from local churches, which were slightly different from the mainstream experience of the continental Catholic Church in 19th century. And they listened to experiences from the US, which could tell a good story of freedom of religion. And they listened to bishops from the Eastern European countries who told what it meant not to have religious freedom, the lack of freedom, as a burden for the church, a burden for the Christians, not to be able to lift up and to speak out their very message. And I think this is an interesting lesson for us now, because it tells us about the necessity to always listen to experiences and to different experiences, to different perspectives in a certain time and in a certain reality. And this is necessary, I think, also today. And now you mentioned the topic of gender, which in some contexts and very often is identified as a kind of ideology. And this, of course, gives the impression that it's something dangerous and something which we have to be against, which might be dangerous for faith or for the true notion of what a human being is and what human dignity is. And I think we should try to think about it in a different way and should open way to a new approach to this, what is meant by gender difference and gender diversity, by listening to people with their experiences of how the reality of being shaped by gender, not only of course, but gender is an element of human identity. And of course, there are different experiences with gender. It's a difference to be a man or a woman, and we know that this dual identity, or these dual identities, are not the only ones. There are diverse human identities. And if you ever listen to people who don't identify them in the gender binary, who cannot identify in the gender binary, for example, you will come into a reflection that we perhaps should try to integrate this reality, this experience in our Christian thinking about anthropology, about who the human being is and about how humans live up with their sexuality and their gender. So it is a question of listening to experiences first, and not to cut off a notion of the diverse reality of people by marking it as ideology. So this, I think, at the moment is a task for thinking of theology and thinking in church context, to at least admit that there are different realities, that there are diverse experiences as to gender, and then to approach what can that mean and how can we approach these challenges that such experiences mean for our traditional Christian anthropology. And then we can go on thinking, reflecting, producing theories, opening up spaces of communication and of discovering new approaches to this kind of reality. I think it would be worth to do this without anxiety, but just by meeting, by learning, by listening, and then discerning what can be integrated in a Christian anthropology. There is some literature about this, there are some theories about this, and it would be better, I think, not to cut our thinking off by this marker of ideology, but just to go into it and to reflect it and to discuss it freely.
Thank you. Listening, yes, it's important. And this morning we have listened to lectures from Professor Kovalo, and I see you are a little bit tired. It was a hard day, and I still have some questions. So, you come from Ukraine, a country suffering the horrors of war. In relation to the topic we are dealing now with, freedom and responsibility, what is, in your opinion, the responsibility of the churches for this political situation? Is there a responsibility related to silence, or maybe to some spoken words?
Thank you so much. Thank you for the question. Indeed, this war, as perhaps any war, including the war in Croatia that happened 30 years ago, it's a special time. It's a time of crisis. And the crisis should be understood properly in the original Greek sense of the word. Crisis means judgment. This is every war is like a doomsday, a judgment day, primarily for us as Christians, as people of religion, as people of faith. In a sense, it is the way how God expects us to act or not to act, to respond to the crisis. So by the way of responding to the war, we are judged by our fellow human beings, and I believe also by God. And this is a sort of, pre-judgment, in a sense, before the great judgment that we'll face. It is also a judgment for, not just for individual members of the churches, but also for the churches per se, as such. This is an opportunity and a responsibility for the churches to react, to raise their prophetic voices, or to choose not to raise their prophetic voices. The churches are left, as well as the individual Christians, they are left free to react, to respond to this judgment, to this crisis, right? And we can see how differently the churches do react. In the case of this war in Ukraine, we hear about different reactions, different statements coming from the churches, or not coming from the churches at all, which is also a position. And I'd like exactly to put the church's attitude to the crisis like this one exactly in the context, in the framework of freedom and responsibility. The churches, as well as individuals who constitute the churches, they are free to express their attitudes. And they need to face consequences, depending on what kind of reaction they have. If we take, for example, the case of the Russian Orthodox Church, I'm not going to explore now how this church has contributed to this war, something that I did in the morning. I'd like to focus more on how this church reacts to this war. It seems that, as I also had the chance to mention in the morning, it seems that the majority of the church is silent, vast majority of the church. That's why it's a silent church, essentially, in the face of the crisis. Among this silent majority, there is a silent majority of this majority, which rather supports the war. There is a silent minority within this majority, which disagrees with the war, but in a silent way, without raising the prophetic voices. And there are some minority groups. A minority group which actually comes out with condemning the war, and there is a minority group which comes with completely and wholeheartedly supporting this war. Those are the moments of judgment, if you want, for the church. I believe always, but especially in the times of crisis, there is a call for the Christians and for the churches to do what God commanded to Adam and Eve in the paradise, to name things. Usually we understand naming things as there was a thing which was unnamed, and Adam and Eve came and they gave a name to that thing. It's not just about that, I believe, this biblical verse. It's also about telling truth about things, about phenomena, including like telling truth about the war. So when we use euphemisms, or when we avoid telling truth about the war, we essentially violate the commandment of God that commanded us to name things. Our task as Christians, and it was not just the task of Adam and Eve, it's also our task now and here to follow this commandment of God and to name things by their proper names. And this is a part of the prophetic service of the church, and of the Christians, of the members of the church. So that we are called to call things by their names. And this is really important for the churches. So by calling things by their names, we essentially respond to the crisis. We cry out, we come out with statements, with declarations, condemning the war, for example. And this is a part of our prophetic service, mission. It is also exactly our response to God's call for us to name things by their names. So, especially in times of crisis, the churches have a challenge and an opportunity to come out, to raise up as prophetic communities, the communities of prophets. That's what we have to do. And that's what, even now and here, we are going to do. Thank you.
I will just maybe go with a few more questions so that we have time to maybe develop a discussion and hear some questions from the public. I would continue with the question to you, Professor Luke. Returning a little bit to this relation of Christians, founders of contemporary society, because it seems to me as a really important issue. And now Professor Cohen spoke about this responsibility to speak. And we also had, during our program, a presentation of a book about rising the voice, about the need to, it's an invitation to courage. It's about accepting migrants. So we had the presentation of this book written by a French father, a French priest. His name is Benoit Dufinity, and it was about raising the voice. So Christians have the freedom to raise their voices in contemporary society. But how can we fully live our mission as Christians in our democratic and pluralistic societies, where our voice is just one of the many voices, without privileges? How can we be the salt and light in the world and in our democratic societies?
So it's a wonderful question, and I think kind of presses in upon the church across Europe and in the States. So just to pick up on that theme of being salt and light, what is salt and light? Salt, and obviously it's drawn from verse from the New Testament. Salt preserves what is good. It's a way of, going back to Cyril's point there, it's about naming what is already good in our society, working with others to preserve that. And then what is light? Light points away in the darkness. It also reveals the darkness, shows the darkness for what it is. It reveals what is hidden and makes it visible. And that's the prophetic element, but also the way in which the church is to embody in its life together, or through establishing new projects. And the church has always done this, setting up hospitals, hospice care, often innovating new forms of care for the least, the lost, and the last, who society overlooks. So it's pointing the way in the darkness and opening out new ways of doing things in response to challenges. And so I think that sense of the church is to build a common life with others, to preserve, and then it's also to act prophetically and to embody new ways of doing things as light. Now, I think within that, there's a profound relationship between what it means to be church and what it means to be in mission. And so often I think there's a sense in which the world cannot know itself as the world without the church. The world doesn't know that it needs salvation. The world doesn't know that it's only of this age. This cannot be the age to come. There are many things the world needs the church to reveal to it. But equally, I would say, and that's very important, and I think the church kind of understands that, it's equally important, if not more important at this moment, that the church cannot be the church without the world. The church cannot understand what it means to be church without being in relationship with the world. And when the church becomes a city on a hill, becomes a self-enclosed space, becomes disconnected from society, doesn't have the quality and character of relationship with society where people trust Christians, where people think that yes, there might be light being pointed to here, where people can come, touch, taste and see that the gospel is good news, because take the example of hospice care as a mode of care for the suffering dying. I think it's a very striking contrast between that and something like the abortion debate. In the abortion debate in Britain and America at least, the first word the church said was no. It thought it was being prophetic. It thought it was telling the world it was the world. But it did it out of the context of relationship. It did it out of the context of listening to the lament of those who are having back-street abortions. And it didn't offer good news. It didn't offer an alternative that people could touch, taste and see. Contrast that with the euthanasia debate. In the euthanasia debate, the first word of the church was yes. Yes to hospice care. And anyone, it was open to anyone. Anyone could touch, see, taste and smell what it meant to rightly care for suffering dying. And because we were for hospice care, it meant we were against euthanasia. But it made sense of the no in the light of the yes. And again, I think this is a Christological, this is a basic confession of who Jesus Christ is. God, and this is a point the Protestant theologian Karl Barth makes, the first word of God to humanity in Jesus Christ is yes. And the no is always consequent on the yes. And too often the first word of the church to the society is no, and therefore they cannot make sense of that no, because there is no yes, there's no good news embodied, lived out, pointed to, that people can make sense of the no in the light of the yes. So I think it's crucial that we have the imaginative, creative, spirit-filled creativity to generate the equivalent of hospice care as our yes, and from that place issue the no. But that yes can only be arrived at through having real relationship with the world and understanding what the real issues are, where the lament is rising from, what the pain, what the source of the pain is. And this makes another point. I don't have to buy the analysis of the people who are crying out in pain, but I do have to tarry, I do have to abide with the cry of pain. So people often have, I think about this in terms of America and Trump supporters. I don't agree with the analysis that Trump supporters have come up with, but I think they have real cause to be upset. There are real issues there that they are trying to make sense of. The conclusions they come to, I profoundly disagree. I don't have to agree with them. But if I don't take time to understand why they're crying out and seeking these false answers to real questions, I'm not doing my job as a Christian to take responsibility for the world I live in and the freedom I have to take the time to listen. So I think it is crucial. We need to understand how to be church. We have to be in relationship with the world, in real relationship with the world. And then the first word has to be yes, and in the light of the embodiment of the yes that is good news, people can touch, taste and smell it. We can say a no, and people can make sense of why the no isn't just a rejection of them and their cry of pain.
So when it comes to yes and no, I would like to just pose one last question that is directed to Professor Mariani and Steins. And it is about the synodal part. So right now we are in the Catholic Church, in the synodal path, and it's universal. And also in our archdiocese we have having gatherings, we had gatherings where we reflected, listened one another, and so this is one thing that everybody shared. Also, tomorrow evening we will, in our meetings, we will have an online connection with Cardinal Mario Craig from the Vatican, who will address us and speak about the synodality and the synodal church. So this is really a very actual topic. And on the other hand, the church in Germany, the Catholic Church in Germany, has its own proper synodal path. And when it comes to this is a path that is often seen as controversial. So I was wondering, have you been involved in it? What is your experience? Is it something controversial, or maybe actually an exercise in freedom and responsibility?
Yeah, thank you for that important question. I think it is not either controversial or a question of freedom, but it's both. To talk about the synodal way in the Catholic Church in Germany perhaps needs a very, very short look upon the context in which this synodal way is set up. As you maybe know, in the German church and many other local churches, very deeply bothered by the coming out of the sexual abuse scandals during the last years. And in Germany, since 2010, this is the major discussion and struggling of church people, how to get to terms with these terrible developments having been disclosed only decades after time of keeping it under the surface and not dealing with it as a matter that is crucial for the whole church. For a very long time, bishops have said, and also lay people have thought, it's single cases, and this is very bad, but it's not a matter of the church as a whole. And now we must admit, we know the numbers, we know many, many, many cases, and we know the strategies how to keep it under the surface. And we cannot say it's just a question of single cases, but a deep structural problem of the church. So, and this is the background against which the synodal way in Germany has been established as a common effort, a joint effort of all responsibles, of the bishops, of the Central Committee of Catholic, of the German Catholics, which is the central organization of the lay persons and the lay associations in the German Church, and different groups from the religious orders and from the associations of priests, and all relevant groups in the German Church are really involved in this process. And the general meaning and the most important motive of this process is to find a way out of this misery of the sexual abuse crisis. And again, we come to crisis as a critical point of judgment. Yes, and I think it's kind of a kairos of a critical moment to correct a way which we have got to know that it is not fruitful, that it is not good, that it hurts people, and that it re-traumatizes people who have been deeply injured by sexual abuse and by spiritual abuse within church context. So it is an issue which really bothers all people in the church in Germany. Now, synodality as a good and deeply rooted in tradition, an idea which is deeply rooted in Christian tradition, we can follow it back up to the New Testament text. And the main idea is what concerns all has to be decided by all. This is also an old principle of theology and of canon law. So this joint effort of the church responsibles of all kinds, has come out as the synodal way. And I think it is a really spirit and to go into it and to face the problems, the structural issues which are behind the problems we have to be aware of, and we have to try to overcome. And for this reason, this big structured synodal way has been constituted as a big assembly of about 230 persons, with a presidium built from the Bishops' Conference and the Central Committee of German Catholics, and which is working in 4 different fora which deal with major issues of church reform. And it is all transparent what is done in this process. You can everything read on the internet, all the texts which are produced by the groups and discussed in the assembly. You can read everything. You don't need to rely on single stories about the synodal way as something very suspicious and revolutionary and destructive for the church. I think this is not true. Just have a look at what is going on. They are discussing the issues of power and the question of power in the church under the notion of participation. They are discussing the question of what is priestly existence today and what is the theological impact of the ordained ministry. They are discussing about the question of women in responsibility in the church, which is of course a critical issue, and they are not only discussing about the question of ordination or not, but of, in a very broad sense, how do we include the competence of women in the responsibility for church issues. And the fourth forum is about living in relationships, about love, sexuality, and partnership. And in this forum, there are all these crucial issues which are always controversial, up to the questions of gender and of overcoming the exclusion of certain persons from participation in the church. So it's a really big effort, and it's a lot of work what has already been done and what still will be done in order to get the church back into a fruitful and a constructive path which restores credibility for a church which is in deep, deep crisis. And for that, I think the German way is kind of a paradigm, which is not only interesting for this local church, but there are so many local churches which have similar problems, and we need to face them in order to overcome them. That's it.
Thank you very much. So with this question, we conclude this part, and we can open the debate. Any questions? If you have questions, we are glad now to...
Okay, we had like a small insight in our topic, and now we're going to have some time for questions. In this kind of panel, we don't have opportunity to create some sort of public debate where you are supposed to have your opinion to discuss a little bit with the professors. But on the other side, we're just having some small opportunity to ask questions, so the people could try to answer a little bit. So please, everybody who wants to pose some question, raise his hand. And then to be precise, concrete, and short, please, because we don't have many time, so just to make a little bit more interesting this panel. Okay, please.
Good evening, Robert Wilson, journalist and theologian from Zagreb. Professor Cyril Howard, Pope Francis had in the couple of weeks said many times, especially in the interview for Reuters, that he is willing to go to Kiev, and Archbishop Gallagher said that he will be maybe possibly in August. Are you happy, and all the members of the panel, are you happy with the intents of the Holy See, the efforts of the Holy See, or you think that it can be done a little bit more? Taking into consideration the diplomacy activities under the table that we are taking.
Thank you indeed. There were, during last months, there were several messages sent from the Vatican about the Pope, whether he would go or would not go to Ukraine. And there were several invitations sent to him from the Ukrainian government, from the Ukrainian president, from the government, and from the churches, particularly the Ukrainian Catholic Church. The latest message was from Pope himself, as you mentioned, that after his visit to Canada, he intended to come to both Moscow, Ukraine, and Kiev. Well, so far the way how the Pope's messages about Ukraine were received in Ukraine, I would say were not unanimous, and some people were upset, some people just wondered what did it mean. It's quite clear, I think, for me and for many other people in Ukraine, that the Pope's intentions are the best. He simply wants to help the Ukrainian people who suffer. He tries to find the best way to help, and also to facilitate the peace process. He's a peacemaker, indeed. Probably that is his motivation to go also to Moscow. So far, his contacts with Moscow were rather unsuccessful. Remember, just when the war started, he visited the Russian embassy to the Holy See in Rome, which was really an unusual step, right? And I would say it was a gesture of humility, of humbleness, and devotion to peace. It didn't work. Then he had several conversations with the church authorities in Russia, including Patriarch Kirill, primarily Patriarch Kirill, but also he had informal conversations, as far as I know. They didn't work either. It happens that the contacts, the conversations, the engagement with the Pope often were presented by the Russian propaganda as if Pope actually contributed to the Russian cause and supported the Russian cause, which was wrong, of course, but that was the way how it was presented. So there is still a danger that if Pope goes to Moscow, his visit will be presented in the way that the Pope himself doesn't want to be presented like that. As far as I know, the Vatican understands this risk, this danger, and still tries to try, kind of attempts to try. This visit, we'll see what will come up with that. In Ukraine, certainly Pope Francis is waited. It would be great if he could come. Still, what will matter, the messages that he will bring. That will be up to him, of course. And we hope that those will be the messages that will not kind of upset or discourage Ukrainians, but encourage Ukrainians, we hope.
Okay, I would just add, if somebody is struggling with English, he can pose the question also in Croatian. Mr. Ivan.
Profesorici Einbach-Štajns, jedno osobnije pitanje. Vi ste možda najduže od nas teologa ovdje sa teološkim stažom, to kao žena. Od nas ovdje. Možete li reći svoje iskustvo, recimo kako je to bilo na jednom, recimo tako, muškom teološkom fakultetu, vaš životni put kao teologije? Možete li ocijeniti, recimo, sada da ste zadovoljni s vašim predavali ste relativno važna pitanja, etiku i tako.
Yes, thank you very much for this question. Actually, when I studied theology, it was there were quite a lot of fellow women students. I studied theology and German literature for being a teacher in when I started, and it was quite a mixed group of students, male and female. But when I proceeded and did a doctorate, the women became fewer, and after having done my doctorate, I had the chance to take a position as assistant at the university, then as minister, in fact, at the institute which I'm leading now. And then, of course, I was a trained teacher. I could have gone to school and started my job, and then I decided to take this job at the university. And of course, this was the critical moment when I decided to go on an academic way. And the first, a bit irritating moment was when my chef, then the professor with whom I started to work, whom I liked very much and to whom I owe very much, then told me, yes, he had to ask first the bishop whether the bishop would agree a woman to do a habilitation from being a professor. So this was in 1987 when I started this job, and this question was put to the bishop. The bishop, fortunately, didn't mind, and he said, okay, that's fine. But already that this had to be clarified first, and it was not self-evident that a woman could go this way is telling, yeah. And then, okay, I went my way, and I finished my studies, and around the middle of the 90s, I applied for chair as professor for the first time, and in 1996 I was granted a chair at a small university in Bavaria. There I was the only woman professor, and in whole Bavaria I was the first ordinary professor of theology, female professor of theology then. This was quite an interesting situation, and in our faculty there were, most of the professors were priests, only one layman, that was the professor of religious education, and then I came and joined the faculty at the age of 36. All others were much older than I, and they looked upon me in a quite paternalist way. So this young woman, she couldn't know how to go on and things like that. And it was a bit a strange situation. So then began this gender thing in my theological experience, in fact. But it changed. And whereas I, as a student, as a doctoral student, never experienced being taught by a female teacher, a female professor, or a female assistant in theology. Students now have role models of both sexes. And this is, I think, very important. I had never a positive role model for being a teacher of theology. Fortunately, in my studies of German literature, I had a very brilliant role model, female role model for being a teacher at the university. But it's quite a strange situation, because it really matters to include the experiences from different perspectives, from different biographies, from different contexts of living. And so it is, I think, very important that we have struggled a lot, my generation of women theologians, we have struggled a lot to get women into the courses and to encourage women to do doctorates and to go on with a theological career. And we also experienced that it is necessary to make it a kind of political issue in theology, that there is a diversity of models, that there are women and men in theology, and it was not an easy way to go. And we always experienced, my colleagues and I, that women were more under suspicion than men, and that many of the female theologians were had to face difficulties to get the Neil Obstant, to get the permission to teach. And some very gifted, very brilliant theologians who tried to think in an innovative way were rejected. And this was indeed were very difficult experiences. And of course, they made us think more political in theology. And we founded an organization in the late 1990s called Agenda Forum of Catholic Female Theologians, in order to have a voice in the church and a voice in academia. And it took us quite a long time to be heard. But now it is an organization with, I think, about 300 women theologians, and it is quite a strong place of encouragement and of mutual understanding and of communication about all the issues we have to deal with as theologians, be it in a female, specific female perspective or in a general perspective. This is kind of my experience. It didn't begin by studying, but later on, when proceeding as a professional theologian. Thank you for the question.
Miroslav Radić, očito mi koji smo ovdje na neki način podržavamo ove mediteranske teološke susrete, ali ima onih koji nisu ovdje i koji ne podržavaju ovakav način govora, razgovora i na neki način čak i kritički osuđuju što sad taj naš biskup ili što on hoće i ne razumiju koji je glavni cilj, što se želi ovim susretima. Pa možda profesor Burić da kaže jedno mišljenje kakvi plodovi se očekuju, jer ima i oni koji su za ovakav način, a oni koji nisu. Što vi mislite, kojim smjerom će ići dalje, naravno ako se i nastavi idućih godina, i možda i nadbistup neka kaže na neki način. Ako ne želi, ne mora. I njega prozivaju.
Okay, can I answer the question or can I? It's better in English. It's better in English. Okay. Do I need to ask the permission of Archbishop to answer about this? This joke. This is already the answer. What is the result of this sort of summer schools where we are open for dialogue, for encounter each other together here and to discuss about topics that are really important for the church today. One of the ideas, I hope that it is that came from Pope Francis' wish that theology needs to develop itself in sense of contextuality. In sense of contextuality, this context is Mediterranean. According to Veritatis Gaudium, Pope Francis gave us in introduction in this document, Veritatis Gaudium, a few criteria how theology can develop itself, how theology can become more responsible for our days or today. One of these criteria is to be open for dialogue, not only with science or other cultures, but also the dialogue with other forms of theology, dialogue with other churches. That means the ecumenical dialogue. And this ecumenical dialogue is not on the sense some sort of formality, but in the sense really to learn from each other how to live together, how to discuss together, to find where is our roots of our Christianity and how to go forward together in the future. So the second criteria is to be open and to receive people with open doors, because the church needs to be opened for everyone. And I think that one of the topics of this year's meetings was also the question how we deal with migrants. This is a very huge question, and we didn't develop theology that will answer this question to ourselves. We have only political answers to these questions. We didn't develop theological questions. And these theological answers we have in the gospel. Something similar what Professor Luke said. We need to make gospel new again, important again for new topics. And also, I see this summer school as opportunity how to develop synodal way of our church. I see this school as some sort of synodal process because we gathered around here young theologians, some theologians that have a little bit experience, and we discussed not as professors to students, but as colleagues, as friends. We discussed openly about issues that bother us. And I saw beautiful and interesting thinking that came from our students, our colleagues, young colleagues, from Protestant tradition, from Orthodox tradition, and that enriched me in these 2 days to become a better theologian, I hope. So I think that some sort of public opinion that came these days or even 2 years ago about this school is really superficial and has nothing really this in public opinion is really superficial, and what happens here is nothing special, but also so fruitful for us to develop ourselves. So really in category of Catholic thought, in Catholic thought in broader sense, where we ecumenically can think, speak, freely speak, discuss, and develop some new ideas. I hope that I answered with yes.
So I can't speak to the specifics of the Croatian situation or the history of this meeting, but it does raise a broader reflection for me about how those who are trying to, in relation to what I said before, think about the mission of the church and how it engages society and trying to discern what is the Holy Spirit doing anew, afresh. How is the Spirit acting to bring you life? It strikes me that whenever the angel of the Lord turns up, the first word always has to be, fear not. Because when God shows up and is doing something new, we always react with fear. It just seems to be the basic response in Scripture. Now, it seems to me, and I was talking to one of the students about this, there is this question of how do we think we're trying to, I'm not saying we necessarily are, but think we're trying to hear what the Spirit is doing, engaging in a process of discernment and listening and talking to work out, figure it out. How do we respond to those who are reacting in fear, or who are reacting negatively or trolling online and throwing nasty words, as it were?
I think often then the reaction is for ourselves to get defensive, and we have a kind of ratcheting up, if we have that word, but like things get more and more and more bitter. And I think the pastoral challenge is not to respond to the first word, but to hear what's really being said beneath that first word. What is being feared? What buttons are being pressed? What anxieties are being raised? And can we absorb the initial reaction to then speak to that underlying reaction and discern? Now, some people are just nasty and they want to make mayhem. You know that phrase, mayhem? I don't know. Yeah, they just want to make the world worse for lots of people. You could just, but that's very few people. Like we know who they are. They're always around. Kind of people who love to make trouble and get energy from making trouble. But that's not most people. Most people is who the angel of the Lord has to address with fear not. And how do we speak that word of fear not to the actual fears, not the presenting first word? And I think that's a very difficult, it's difficult spiritually, it takes enormous spiritual discipline for us not to react, but it's also spiritual discerning. How do we actually hear what's really being said underneath the initial reaction? So I think I find that very personally challenging. My first, my kind of male English, get in there, kind of fine. But actually, I have to kind of hold myself and then have a check and spiritually ask, what's really going on? And I think that's always a challenge for us, because a new thing always invokes fear.
As a last question, can I ask just briefly from all four of you to answer to one question in one or at most two sentences? And the question is, all of you are like famous theologians, you know. That's the reason why we called you to these meetings. And can you say just for you in your life, what is theology for you in your life?
Well, I will answer with only one sentence. For me, it's like both hobby and profession.
Well, for me, theology is a real life project, and to go a bit deeper into what the meaning of the gospel is for today. That's my issue.
One sentence? So I mean, echoing what's just been said, faith, I mean, the technical, to give a horrible, boring technical definition, faith-seeking wisdom about who we are in relation to God and each other. That's how I understand. But to echo something I said before, I think theology is a mystery about how to participate in God's endless communication to us, and then the gift of being able to communicate that to others so that they too could participate in the Word of God.
And for me, theology is just only one word: forgiveness. For me, theology is forgiveness. It is gift that is given to me, I hope, and it is me to give this gift to others, to illuminate what I achieved, to illuminate in encounter with words of God, with words of God, and to try to give as possible is to others this meaning of life that came from God. And this is it.
Thank you. Thank you for your answers. And for final words, Branko spoke about magisterium. So to raise a little bit, importance of this panel, if the bishop wants to say some word, I'm going to give him the floor. Following Cardinal Sarah is going to be silent.
Okay, so with this, we close this panel. I thank very much our lecturers and also all of you for your time and your patience. So have a good night and thank you very much for coming.